I'm Dr. Yvonne Cason, the president of Spiritual Awakenings International. Welcome, everyone, to our Spiritual Awakenings International Presents. And we are absolutely delighted how Spiritual Awakenings International has grown. We now have subscribers in 102 countries around the world. So we are delighted. Please take a moment now and put into the chat where you're joining us from today. I'm actually joining you from Toronto, Canada, even though the picture behind me is from Switzerland, the Alps in Switzerland. Our speaker today is joining us from the USA, Florida, Boulder Creek, California, someone else from Toronto, Indianapolis. Welcome, everybody from everywhere around the world. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Philip Goldberg. Now, Philip has been studying the world's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years as a practitioner, as a teacher, and also as an author. He is an ordained interfaith minister, spiritual counselor, and meditation teacher who was trained by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi back in 1970. Philip Goldberg has authored or co-authored more than 25 books, including his very famous American Vedas and The Life of Yogananda. Philip hosts the Spirit Matters podcasts, and he also serves on the board of directors of the Association for Spiritual Integrity. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Philip Goldberg.
Thank you, Yvonne. I'm very happy to be with you all. I have high regard for the organization and what it stands for, and I'm honored to be invited. Yvonne asked me to describe my own spiritual awakening to begin this presentation. And I'm grateful because it got me thinking about my own spiritual history and awakening experiences in general and what that means. And so it will segue into the topic of the day. In my experience, and I've been interviewing people and writing about spirituality and teaching for more than 50 years now. Some so-called awakenings are dramatic and spectacular and flashy, and therefore very memorable. And usually transformative. Others are undramatic, maybe the great majority. And I know people who wouldn't even call themselves or put themselves in the category of people who have had awakenings, but they've had very substantial spiritual lives for some time. Because some awakenings can be subtle and almost inconspicuous, but they can have a enduring and life-altering impact on people's lives. And mine are in that second category. It began way back when I looked like this. And oh God, I wish I still had those beads. And mine were gradual and subtle, but nonetheless transformative. What mine were in the category of what Aldous Huxley called unitive mystical experience, the sense of oneness and connection with all that is. I'd never had visitations from angels or celestial beings or near-death experience or astral traveling or voices or visions. No seeing the face of God, so to speak. Mine were more like repeated glimpses. They were more in the category of revelation or epiphany than experiences that have to do with the senses or something dramatic. But they were not, when I say revelations, I don't mean just intellectual understanding. It was sort of gradual and sometimes momentary, sort of insightful realizations. It was deep knowingness. And sometimes it was in the oh wow category, and other times it was almost like remembering something. Yeah, that word. Yeah, I knew that. And the knowingness was transformative in many ways because it shifted my awareness. It shifted my perception of the world and changed how I approach life and got me on the spiritual path in a meaningful way. And it was supplemented by my insatiable appetite in those days over a few year period to find out more about what life is and who I am and what my place in the universe was. And in other words, I wanted spiritual insight. I wanted teaching. Because what I'd glimpsed in experience had to be understood. And I understood the experience because of my studies and my delving into reliable spiritual teachings. And the understanding supplemented the practice because I recognized in my experiences what the sages and the commentators were speaking about. And I have to, first for example, in the yoga tradition, or what people think of as Hinduism, there are things called mahavakyas, great utterances, and they're usually associated with phrases from the Upanishads. And I was discovering these things because I was reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and all the Western philosophers who commented on them. And it's one thing to see aham brahmasmi, I am Brahman, Brahman being all that is. Sometimes people think of it as a synonym for God, but it's more than that. It's the absolute reality of existence. And everything is Brahman and everything comes from Brahman in the texts. And I was having glimpses of experience of I am Brahman. And Tattvamasi, the most famous of the Mahavakyas, thou art that, is told to a seeker in the Upanishads. And Sarvam Kalvidam Brahman, all this is Brahman. So I am Brahman, you are Brahman. everything is Brahman, or that. Sometimes it's just that with a capital T. And Brahman is one without a second. Reality is one. It's a non-dual teaching. And I was having glimpses of this in my experience. And I have to confess that at the time, those experiences early on were drug-induced. It was part of the counterculture scene at that time. I was not a heavy acid head or anything like that, but I had enough experiences with, different things. And I was having these moments, these glimpses. And if I didn't have the understanding to go with it, I might have been completely derailed, like a lot of people were in the 60s who just couldn't escape the drug culture, and there were many casualties. And people went to shrinks because they said, I'm experiencing myself as separate from my body, and that became a pathology that, people got onto medication about because the shrinks didn't understand. But I was lucky because I was reading this stuff, and I saw that what I was reading must be real because I was having experiences like that. And what I was experiencing that seemed to be revelatory had some validity because, look, these reliable texts were validating these things and pointing to them. And at the time, I was part of the counterculture scene, and a lot of these revelations were amplified by the music we were listening to and the books we were reading and passing around. And soon after that, some, gurus and swamis and Zen roshis and stuff were coming around and became more accessible. So there were actual teachers. And in my life at that time, George Harrison's discovery of Indian music and his trip to India and his being turned on to Indian philosophy had a big impact on people like me. I remember hearing Within You, Without You when Sgt. Pepper album was released in 1967, during the so-called Summer of Love, I should say. And there were lyrics like, when you've seen beyond yourself, then you may find peace of mind is waiting there. And the time will come when you see we're all one and life flows on within you and without you. And I was having experiences like that, little glimpses, little hints of that. And it was like, this was an oh, wow, this stuff is real. And so I was one of the lucky ones who was also reading people like Emerson and Thoreau and William James and Carl Jung and Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts and Joseph Campbell and all these people in language I understood were validating my awakening experiences and this gradual awakening to a new way of seeing the world. And some of it came in the form of fiction. I was reading Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, and Journey to the East. And I was, Somerset Maugham's The Razor's Edge, which is about a spiritual seeker in New York who everybody I knew was identifying with. And who goes to India and meets somebody who was modeled after Ramana Maharshi. And there's J.D. Salinger and his Franny and Zooey, and he portrayed spiritual seekers in the world. So it wasn't, ancient texts of, gurus in the forest talking to renunciates. It was people I could relate to. I remember one of Salinger's stories that I read early on called Teddy, where a young boy is talking about his own spiritual awakening and says he was watching his kid sister drink milk, and he realized that all she was doing was pouring God into God. And I said, oh, yeah. I kind of know what that means. I can't say I had that experience, but it's something like it. And of course, I read autobiography and other, texts by authentic spiritual teachers. And all this meant a lot to me because it validated what we could call mini awakening experiences, these revelations. And mainly I came to know that, I wasn't just this body. I wasn't just this ego, this personality called Phil. I was, as Walt Whitman put it, one of my heroes, I am not contained between my hat and boots. And I am the mate and companion of people, all just as immortal and fathomless as myself. And so, while a lot of people were having these kind of awakening, you could say, and experiences, many people just got stuck and were taking drugs for their own sake and just getting high, and there were a lot of casualties. But some of us, and I credit my intellectual inquiry for this, and my good karma, some of us said, I want the real thing. I don't want just the occasional drug experience, because with every high there seemed to be 5 or 10 lows, and then it was hit or miss, but it's pointing to something real. So these little awakenings led to a change of life, and I said, I want the real thing. I want consistency, and I want the real promise of spiritual awakening, not just this hit and miss experiences with bad side effects. And so in my inquiries, I was reading books about Zen and books about yoga and everything. I remember reading a Buddhist text where the famous metaphor that all the books, all the teachings, they're just the fingers pointing to the moon. They're not the moon itself. And I realized, okay, I want the moon. And the texts were saying, for the moon, for the real experience, you need practices. You need what the yogis call sadhana, regular practice. And the Zen books, the yoga books, they all pointed to meditative practice. And when the Beatles in 1967 took up transcendental meditation, and then later, just a few months later, went to India, and this was, everybody in the world heard about this, and especially young people who identified with the Beatles. It became life-changing. Everybody wanted a taste of this. And we said, if you were the most famous young people in the world and had more money than God, why would you go to a funky ashram in India for a few months when you could go to the most luxurious places in the world? So there must be something to it. And I read enough, so I decided I'd try that, and it was life transforming. In my case, became the centerpiece of my daily practices ever since. Of course, I've acquired many other practices as well over the years. But at that time, these glimpses of transcendence, of oneness, of I am not just my body, I am infinite, was coupled with the fact that when I took up meditation, I felt transformed, and I was having these little mini awakenings on a frequent basis. And my standard became the consistent sort of experience of what the teachings promised. And I was drawn to not, you can have flashy experiences and become psychic and, learn to walk on water or whatever, but just deep peace. My life at the time was a mess. And so the promise of, as in the Bhagavad Gita, of the yogi being like a lamp that does not flicker in a windless place. That's what comes with the mind being absorbed in union with the self, the state of yoga. And I had those glimpses, and I wanted to make them permanent, or at least consistent. And I wanted the experience I'd had that in the yogic text they call witnessing. And the metaphor in the Upanishads is like two golden birds perched on the same tree, intimate friends. The ego, the individual personality, and the self, the infinite part of us, infinite consciousness, dwell in the same body. The former, the ego, eats the sweet and sour fruit of life, while the latter observes in stillness. And I've had glimpses of that. Oh, look, my body is doing things. My mouth is talking, but there's this part of me that's not the mouth talking, witnessing the mouth talking and the body moving. And that place resided in bliss and in permanent peace. And I thought, that's what I want more of that. And so that's what I was drawn to. And that's what my awakening, if you could call it that, consisted of. These subtle, consistent experiences that were absolutely transforming and redefined who I was and my place in the universe and the cosmos, and what was truly important in my life. I took seriously something back in those days, especially, and it was said in relation to people in the hippie world taking drugs all the time to transform their consciousness. The great religious scholar of religion, Houston Smith, most famous for having written the introduction to my book, American Veda. No, I'm kidding. He was world famous, and I was lucky that he wrote it toward the end of his life. He said the important thing is not altered states, but altered traits. How does it affect your life? Does it make you a better person? Are you a happier person, a kinder person, and so forth? And everybody was after altered states. And some people had altered states of consciousness and everything, but their lives were a mess. And I didn't want that kind of experience. Having said that, in those especially early years of becoming a consistent meditator and picking up yoga practices and everything, I was just really oriented toward transformative practices, spiritual practices from wherever I could find them. And I learned to teach meditation. I was trained, as Yvonne said, and I was immersed in that world. And every once in a while, I'd meet somebody or hear somebody speak or read about somebody who had the other kind of spiritual awakenings, the spectacular kind, the dramatic kind. And I'd say, why don't I have those? It would be nice to have an astral travel and to speak to angels and have celestial visions and so forth. I want some of that. And I felt maybe I'm spiritually inadequate because I'm not having those experiences and they sound so great. But over time, I learned to stop wishing for them and stop trying to make them happen. Because what really mattered were the altered traits and the deep inner peace and the witnessing and the consistency. And also, I'd met some people who had those dramatic awakenings. And of course, they were temporary. And then they wanted them back so badly. They yearned for them so much that it led to a sort of dark night of the soul. And why can't I have that again? Why can't I make this happen to me again? And in some cases, focusing so much on having these esoteric experiences and abilities and powers that in their absence and in their trying to get them back, their personal lives got out of whack and there was imbalance. And so I learned from that and stopped wishing for them. And it was along that time that I first came across the saying from a Zen master that became the sort of theme of this talk, which was enlightenment is an accident and meditation makes you accident prone. And I took that to mean all spiritual practices that transform the mind and the body and the nervous system and the apparatus of perception. That one of the reasons we do these things is to become accident prone, to increase the odds of awakening coming to us. As awakenings, in my experience, can't be coerced or planned. They're like what we call in the West grace. And that's unpredictable. But as the great 19th century Indian master Sri Ramakrishna said, that grace, you can compare it to the wind. The wind blows, it's there, but you have to set your sails. Otherwise, it doesn't do you any good. You can't receive it. You're not open to it. And so that is a segue to the topic of my talk, which is, something I learned from those experiences, that which is the importance of sadhana, of consistent spiritual practice to stabilize awakenings, to integrate them into the human part of ourselves, our daily lives, and to provide continuity and stabilization of awakening. And of course, I've seen progress in along those lines in my life over the years, with ups and downs, and what seemed to be backsliding at times. Just ask my wife. And yet, when I look back over the course of time, the consistency of the stabilization, the intensity of the awakening moments, they've all increased. And, so progress can be gradual, progress can be sudden. There's always examples of people suddenly becoming enlightened, Eckhart Tolle being one. But most people just progress gradually. And you'll know them by their fruits, as it says in the Bible. In any event, the model, the typology, I found very useful when it comes to thinking about practices and the tremendous diversity of practices that we're fortunate enough in the modern world to be able to choose from because of organizations like Spiritual Awakenings International and all the teachers on YouTube and all the easy availability of sacred texts. And, this is unprecedented. In the old days, if you wanted to learn stuff, it would depend on the quality of the local guru or the parish priest or the neighborhood imam or whatever. Now we have access to everything, which can make life confusing in making choices. But if one agrees that regular practice is important in this enterprise of spiritual development we're all on, then it pays to have a framework for them. And in my experience, for me, the 4 classic pathways of yoga that go back beyond, there's a chapter on 3 of the 4, and people debate whether there's a 4th in the Bhagavad Gita. So it goes back thousands of years. And the 4 principal paths are defined, as many of you know, as bhakti yoga, which is essentially the path of devotion, what people think of as the path of the heart. And karma yoga, the path of action. Karma means action. Of course, there's a lot of connotations to the word, emphasizing service, selfless service to others. Jnana yoga, sometimes spelled with a G instead of a GY, Gyan Yoga, which is intellectual for people who are mind-oriented like me. We're emphasizing study and discernment. And Raj Yoga, which is not mentioned by name in the Gita and other old texts, but has come to be seen as a path in itself. And some people say, well, this particular chapter is really about that. It's a practical path, emphasizing methods and practice, psychophysical practices. It's often called the yoga of meditation because some of the leading commentators would refer to that and emphasize meditation. But it could be expanded to mean, all kinds of practices that are not sectarian, but can be applied by anybody, but that take you to deep within the self, and meditation being a central one, mindfulness practices, but also practices that we associate with physical yoga, breathing, stretching and bending and so forth. So, and others, contemplative walking, prayer, certain kinds of prayer. So what's important to understand here is that these are just categories of spiritual practice. They're different approaches to the sacred, toward the experience of intimacy with the divine. And each of these categories has value. And within each one, there's a wide variety of specific practices that have been developed in different traditions over the centuries. But it's also important to recognize that while we might be drawn to a particular one of those paths by virtue of our personalities and our backgrounds and our needs at any given moment, most people, they're not mutually exclusive. Very few serious people, spiritual people that I've met, adhere to only one. They may consider themselves primarily bhaktas or karma yogis or whatever, but they do other things. Even the Hare Krishnas, who are the great bhakti followers in the West, they also meditate every day. They also do service work all the time. They also study the texts. And it's similar in all spiritual traditions, including, the deeper elements of Judaism and Christianity and Islam and, of course, Buddhism. And you find these categories, even if they don't use the terms. And so, there are people on any given Sunday morning in the Western world in churches who are sincere bhaktas. They don't know that, but they're busy worshiping Jesus or Mary or whatever, and they're ecstatic, and and then everybody, they all study. So these are not just sort of yoga paths or Hindu paths or Buddhist paths. They're categories that apply to all the traditions in the world, including the unaffiliated, don't label me spiritual but not religious people. They draw from practices in the same way others do. They're just usually more open-minded about them. And I find, as a sort of side note here, realizing the commonality of spiritual practices across traditions, and you find this, I'm sure, in SAI, that's where you find unity. That's why you find commonality. In the commonality of practices, oh, you may pray this way, I may pray that way, but we end up having a similar experience. And this is very important in our quest for unity in the world and to break down the divisions that often are associated with religion. People kill each other over dogma and belief system. Mystics don't kill each other. They just have a good time together. And they share practices, and they see the commonality and the oneness. So let's take a quick look at each of these individually. So under the category of bhakti, I'm doing bhakti first because when you think about spirituality throughout the world, it's the most common form. Worship, private worship, congregational worship, coming together in group in prayer to something or somebody. There has to be a dualism in bhakti. There has to be something we relate to, communicate with, commune with. And even the great non-dual teachers in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, like the great Advaita Vedantist Shankara, they all also did or advocated these kind of devotional practices. Ramana Maharshi, was the quintessential non-dualist. He said, yes, of course, go do your puja, do your ceremony, do your worship, because they recognize that these experiences can lead to the oneness and the revelation of non-duality. So chanting, singing songs of praise and so forth, making offerings, rituals, observing the Sabbath, doing pilgrimages, these are all forms of bhakti, forms of devotional practice and worship. Offerings to a form of divinity. And here I have to mention the concept of Ishta Devata in the Hindu tradition. It means essentially the form of the divine that you prefer. People go to India and they see all these shrines and all these images of deities and they think it's polytheistic. No, everybody knows that all these forms are just different expressions of the one divine reality. But people have their preferences. So some people are are drawn to Jesus, and some people are drawn to other forms, Krishna or some incarnation of Buddha or whatever. I'll tell you a story where it was a big aha for me. I was living in LA for many years. And one day I was on, if you know LA, you know the 3rd Street Promenade, which is closed off to traffic, and it's shops and restaurants and coffee shops and so forth. And there's always a lot of street entertainers on weekends in the summer. So one night I'm on the promenade, and these Hare Krishna people were doing their thing, chanting the Krishna mantras and dancing and all that. And then, people were enjoying it and clapping along and singing along. And then all of a sudden, this group of Hasidic Jews came by. They must have been out for the evening. And they joined the Krishnas. And there they were, the Hasids dancing, the Krishnas dancing, enjoying one another, laughing, and so forth. And when the Sanskrit chants were over, the Jews took over, and they were doing the Hebrew, and no one knew any of that stuff, but everybody was celebrating. And there were, people, and whoever they were joining in. And I kept singing, all we need now is a gospel choir, so I kept hoping one would show up. But that was an important insight about the universality of these experiences and the commonality and the potential for sharing across traditions. If you sat down the Krishnas and the Hasids and, Christians, worshipers, and started talking about belief systems and dogmas, they'd be fighting within minutes or arguing. Well, many of them argue even within their traditions with each other. But put on the music, start chanting and dancing around, and you have this unity. And the same thing happens if you look at the other paths. So Gyanis, for example, the sacred text they're drawn to could be the Bible, it could be the Old Testament, as with these guys, or the New Testament here. It could be the Quran or any of the sacred texts. And the commentaries, every tradition has, or the traditions that have a sacred text, they also have voluminous commentaries that people study and argue over and so forth. And they have methods of study. It's not, obviously, Bible study and, all this can be very superficial and just obligatory and routine, or designed to indoctrinate people and, persuade them. But in the deeper aspects of every tradition, in the esoteric, mystical, they have methods of study, methods of engaging in the sacred texts that transform them from just merely memorization or understanding into a spiritual practice, a practices that take you deep and that use the mind. The ultimate definition of Gyan Yoga is to use the mind to transcend the mind. So you start with the, intellect engaged. You go deeper. And at a certain point, the texts are left behind, the thoughts are left behind. And the great model for this is in Advaita Vedanta, and people like Ramana Maharshi have these methods of self-inquiry. And it says, just keep asking yourself, who am I? Who am I? What am I? But that it sounds like an intellectual thing. You're trying to figure out who I am. No. If you really engage in it the way it's taught, eventually the mind gives up, because the mind can't know the ultimate, but it can take you to the doorstep But then you have to let go and leave it behind. And that's the ultimate, to discern through the mind what is beyond the mind, to discern the temporal from the eternal, the profane from the sacred, the real from the unreal. Take me from the unreal to the real, it says in one of the prayers. It's like, how many, you may know about Zen koans, these intellectual puzzles that the Zen students are to engage in, and they go to the Zen master. On my podcast, by the way, I just interviewed Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who has a new book coming out called Zen Mind, Jewish Mind. It will appear on my podcast in a couple of weeks. And in it, he talks about how the Jews developed methods of inquiry and study that are very similar to what goes on in Zen koan practices. But it's also, it goes on in ashrams and monasteries everywhere in every tradition. But the engagement of a Zen koan is to take you so the mind gives up. And then you have the aha, the transcendence that, oh, the reality is not to be understood by the mind. It's beyond mind. And that leads to experience. Here's more traditions engaged in their Gyan studies. The Sikhs, for example, if you go to the Golden Temple in India and Amritsar, the whole centerpiece is not about a person or a deity, it's about the book. And it's the book is the thing. Service, karma yoga. Some people are drawn to this as their spiritual path. Mother Teresa was a karma yogi. Martin Luther King, you could say, was a karma yogi. Mahatma Gandhi was a karma yogi. They were deeply spiritual people who took their spiritual insights and their spiritual commitment into the world to help others, to make the world a better place. Now, there are many people who do this, all the churches and synagogues and mosques that have social service projects like the people here depicted. And sometimes that could be, like with study, superficial. It could even be egotistical. Look at me. I'm doing good in the world. I'm a really good karma yogi. I'm a better karma yogi than you. So it could have those elements. But in its purity, when done correctly, it's done without serving the ego. It's done in the absence of personal desire. And the way it's outlined in the yogic texts, without attachment to the results. It's the doing, the serving for its own sake, not even wanting to be thanked by the people you help or whatever. And anybody who was ever a caretaker, I'm not a parent, but any spiritually deep parent, anybody caring for a sick relative or a sick spouse, anybody who helps in a soup kitchen or a hospital, who volunteers, you have these moments where you're not thinking of yourself. I've had that, quite inadvertently. Like when my father was very sick and I was helping him, I had these moments and I realized, why am I feeling so happy and content when I just, I haven't slept all night and I've been immersed in this stuff? It's because I was outside of my ego. I wasn't thinking about myself. And it always puts me in mind of a Swami who I was once present, who was asked something, and he said, well, if you want to be depressed, just think about yourself all the time. It's in attending to the outside of the ego and the the lives of others, the well-being of others, or of the society, that a certain break, spiritual awakenings come from that. And finally, Raj Yoga, which is, as I said, a kind of not as clear cut, but it's an orientation toward practice, toward method or sadhana. And as I said, traditionally, mainly meditative practice, but we know there are a huge variety of practices called meditation, huge variety of practices called mindfulness. They often get mixed up, and they can include the psychophysiological practices, not just yoga asanas like this, not just yoga breathing called pranayama like this. And I included these people in the upper left corner because, even secular people engage in what we could call Raj Yoga. They're out for self-improvement and to have a better life. And they've learned, you can meditate in your office and there are results to be had. It's not just, being a yogi, sitting cross-legged and stuff. But you can expand the range. In India, of course, they talk about yoga asana practice, the stretching and bending, and the hundreds of forms of breathing exercises and meditation. But Tai Chi, Qigong, Sufi dancing, all kinds of, we saw the bhaktas singing and dancing. Well, the motion of that is involved in singing. Thich Nhat Hanh has methods of meditative walking. These too can be considered sort of aspects of Raja Yoga. And of course, there's a lot of mixing and matching that can be done. So karma yogis who don't do other practices and just do their service work, they're in danger of burning out all the time, of having compassion fatigue. So the smart ones also have meditation practices before they go and do their service work. And they come home and they do some movement practices to recenter themselves and work off the stress. And so there's a lot of mixing and matching. Even the jnana yogis who are so oriented toward the mind and study and all that, they find particularly if they're part of a spiritual lineage that teaches them to do these things. Like Yvonne is very familiar with Yogananda's lineages and his world, and she'll be the first to tell you that these four paths are found within the teachings that Yogananda offered. Very similar in all the other lineages. They do all these things. They chant, they study the texts, they go to discourses from experts, they do some service work, they volunteer, they work you go to India in the ashrams, and they're all doing some kind of service work for the villages, and the people there have to work in the kitchen and all that. They put people to those, they incorporate elements of this, even if there's a particular emphasis. So a lot of the people I know who are dedicated to their spiritual lives will mix and match from these traditions according to their needs, day to day, week by week, and even if they're mainly oriented to one another. So as I said about myself, for more than 50 years, I meditate every day. But over the years, I've acquired things I do before meditation, things I do after meditation. I don't always do them. I tune into what seems to be needed in those moments. And I've acquired a repertoire of things I do at other times. I have chants, mantra-based chants that I do it depending on my needs. And I may do it while I'm walking in the woods, or I may do it while I do some yoga or some breathing, and which I don't do every day, but I do according to my needs. I meditate every morning, but this is how I start my day, with my yoga practice. That's me, slightly younger. No, okay. I just love that picture. But so that's what I have to say, and I want to encourage everybody to let me get that on, to dig a little deeper into the four principal pathways and see what's in them and what it can add to your life as you move along in the path. Maybe there's times when some deeper understanding and study might be useful, or times when it might be a good idea to get out and help others in service, or times when you wish to acquire a new meditative practice, or times when you're moved to be thankful to a deity or the divine in general. And there's repertoire of practices that can be done at different times of day. That's good to sort of have it at our disposal. Why? Because to get back to my points at the beginning, spiritual awakenings can be sudden and powerful moments that are transformative, but they can also be subtle and gradual. And if we want consistency of transformation and growth, then having practices is a very good idea. Now, I've been given permission before we conclude to do some shameless self-promotion, because I recognize the needs of the embodied Phil Goldberg and his his work in the world. So I will leave this. These are, you could take a screenshot or write them down or whatever. My website is philipgoldberg.com. If you want to email me, this is my preferred, most reliable email address. Yvonne mentioned my well, let me just go in order. I started a Substack. So instead of mailing to my mailing list once a month or so, I can post more frequently whatever I want to share. Like I shared this seminar on my Substack the other day. And so please subscribe to my Substack. You can find, it's called Practical Spirituality with Philip Goldberg. And you just go here, philipgoldberg.substack.com, and you can subscribe. It's free. My podcast on the mindbodyspirit.fm platform, that's also free. And I post on there every couple of weeks a new interview. There are probably about 60 now, and you can go to the archive and hear interviews with some really wonderful people who have a lot to offer. And there's more to come on both Substack and Spirit Matter. So please do subscribe and stay in touch. I guess it's perfect timing. I was telling Yvonne before we started that I have a lot of notes, but I don't know how the timing is going to be. But it worked out perfectly.
Awesome.
So thank you for listening, all of you. And now we have some time for questions and comments.
So if
Okay.
anybody has any questions for Phil, please go ahead and write them into the chat, and I will ask on your behalf. But I first want to say thank you, Phil, for such a profound and highly informative presentation. And I also really appreciated you being so personal with us and sharing about your own awakening story. I loved some of your historical pictures. I too,
Well,
was somebody influenced by the Beatles.
I know. I can get away with that with people of a certain age. But no, I appreciate the question, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to think about all that stuff.
Awesome, awesome. So I have a couple questions for you while we're waiting for more questions from the audience. So how do you recommend people discern? Because it's very normal, and you described it yourself, that at a certain point in your spiritual awakening process, you check out a whole bunch of different paths. You check out this teacher, you check out that teacher, you check out this technique, that technique. What's your recommendation on how to balance that versus the importance of going really deep on a spiritual path if you're going to actually have results? Could you comment on that, please?
Oh, yeah. Look, this is something I've been thinking about for decades, and people smarter than me have studied and written about. And the intensity of this question is a new phenomenon because of all that's available to us at the click of a mouse. But even as far back as the 19th century, in a far less diverse world of the Bengal, province outside of Calcutta, Ramakrishna talked about people who are superficial seekers, and he compared them to people who want to get water out of the ground, and they go from place to place digging holes, but they never go deep enough in any of them to get to the water. So they end up with a bunch of holes without tapping the water. In today's world, people talk about cafeteria spirituality, like it's a big smorgasbord. And Houston Smith used to talk about that. You can go to the spiritual smorgasbord, the buffet, and sample all kinds of things, but it doesn't guarantee that you'll get the nutrients you need. You just have a taste of a lot of things. It's kind of being spiritually promiscuous instead of committing to, a relationship. And so, but there's a balance to be had. As many people find, in the early stages, people often just, experiment and fiddle around. But if you find something that works, committing to it, at least for a while, so you go deep and give it a real test, is, important. So the discernment comes from, first, making smart choices, getting good recommendations, finding reliable teachers, reliable lineages, methods that have a proven value. Yes, as somebody said, you go to the smorgasbord, you end up with a lot of desserts. But if you look for reliability, if you get good recommendations from friends, I studied with this teacher, I learned this method, I recommend that practice, try it. But don't just try it once. Try it and see if it works. Commit to doing it for a while. Doesn't mean you have to do it the rest of your life. It may serve a good purpose for a few weeks or 10 years or whatever. But if you don't go deep enough into it and give it a little time, you won't know if it's useful. You won't know if it works for you. And what's the test? Well, some people go by what they experience during the practice, which has value. But the other is, does it change your life? How do you feel after doing it?
Mhm.
If you do it every day for a month, is your life changing? Are you have little more inner peace because you're doing it? These are, to me, the criteria. And we have to be discerning, especially in this world where we have so much. And people, even people who commit to a teaching or a teacher or a lineage or a traditional religion or a new religion, sometimes the tension comes from, do I just do the practices that are being recommended here, or is it okay to go outside? And people feel guilty sometimes for searching. But if you feel the need, I saw this in the world I inhabited in the 70s, and all the interviews I've done over the years, it's just a very common thing. You're in a committed relationship, so to speak, with a group or an organization or a set of teachings, and you reinforce one another. And it's easy to believe that you have everything you need in this container. And it may be true for some people. But sometimes you start feeling a yearning and think, hey, this is not, I'm needing something else, and it's not being satisfied here.
Mhm.
And I want to look elsewhere. And sometimes that's discouraged, and you could be ostracized. So there's that to be considered as well. And I don't see any problem with being committed to something, but also supplementing it with other things that might come in handy, because not every tradition has everything the people need. Look at my own life. I was raised by atheists. I had no religious or spiritual training, but I came to these awakenings in the 60s for the reasons I mentioned. I had no interest in conventional religion. But over the years, I came to really love Christmas. And I said, well, because of Yogananda was so fond of Jesus, I said, what am I missing here? So I read the New Testament, and I said, I can learn from this guy. He was a great guru. And so I'm going to go to Christmas Eve at a church and celebrate his birthday and sing the songs, even though I don't believe the dogma. And so there are ways to take advantage of the diversity and still be deep, still have the joy and the spiritual progress that comes with experimentation and curiosity, without sacrificing the depths that come from a committed set of practices or practice. Trial and error. Let's use all the cliches. The proof is in the pudding.
Thank you, Phil. I know for myself personally, my spiritual awakening process, it was, I studied with different teachers on different paths. And if I look back, I sort of transitioned from a bhakti teacher to a karma yoga teacher to a jnana yogi teacher. And for myself personally, it was always a feeling of it being partially right, but not complete. Exactly what you said. Until I found, for myself personally, the Yogananda path. And then it was like, this is the shoe that fits. And somebody else made that comment, so I just wanted to throw it back to you. Someone wrote to me directly, and I'm someone who experienced a sudden and spontaneous awakening. I found that over the years, I naturally gravitated towards all 4 of those paths without actually knowing that's what I was doing. She says, thank you, Phil, for that enlightenment on this.
That makes me very happy, because I've experienced that with people. They don't necessarily know this language. You could use that's what happens. If you're serious about your spiritual life, you're going to find that as things develop, you're drawn to different kinds of practices or different kinds of engagement because that's the need that arises at that stage of your development. So having this sort of model can be helpful, but people gravitate, without knowing the names of these things, or they call them something else.
Awesome. Oh, sorry, I accidentally pulled you off there, Phil. I have another question I'd like to ask you, which is about looking at the picture behind me of the mountains that I put up on purpose. Because I think, and I think you were saying the same thing, and particularly with your various pictures, that there are many paths up the mountain, up the spiritual mountain. Could you, from different directions, depending on our culture, traditions, etc., would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, and this is Houston Smith. I guess I'm quoting Houston Smith a lot today. He actually, in the introduction he wrote for my book, he mentions this, but he's been talking about it for decades, that there's two aspects of, well, he would call it religion, but spirituality. There's the exoteric, meaning the belief systems, the rituals, the particular forms that people take, the dogma, the doctrines. And then there's the esoteric, which is the realm of we're talking about, the realm of spiritual experience, the realm that the mystics and the yogis and the deep people go to. That's the realm of spiritual experience. If you focus there on spiritual practice and spiritual experience, you find, as I said earlier, the unity and the commonality. And one of the great metaphors for that is, and it goes way back in India, that there are many pathways up the mountainside, and people take the pathway that suits them or is most convenient for them. But they all lead to the top of the mountain, where the experience is the same, even if people got there in different ways, and even if they describe what they're experiencing in different ways. There are other metaphors, of course, as well. Many streams and tributaries, but they all end up in the ocean of oneness. Ramakrishna used to talk about the river, the great, the Ganges. If you go down, you follow the length of the river, you find people speaking different languages and using different kind of vessels to gather water, and they have different names for the water, different uses for the water, but it's all water. And that's what you discover in exploring the different traditions if you go deep enough. But it seems to be true. And there's enough scientific research now comparing the experiences of practitioners from different traditions and using different methods, having very similar experiences that you can see on a brain imaging and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. That seems to be what we're learning, that the sages always knew. But the more that becomes manifest in people's everyday lives, the more harmonious the world will be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. We've had a number of comments of people saying just how helpful they found your presentation, and a couple people saying that theirs has been a more gradual awakening with those very sort of subtle aha experiences, and that they didn't really put it together until they heard you describe it. So that's awesome. Yeah. I have one final question I would like to ask you about, which is, having grown up in the 60s through that first period of psychedelic exploration, having seen the positives and the negatives of it. And right now there's sort of a segment of people who are, again, it seems like they didn't live through what we lived through, and they're trying to seek enlightenment through the use of psychedelics. So what wisdom would you like to share about that in terms of that current exploration?
Yeah, there's a lot going on ever since it became legal again to study. So, first of all, there's a lot of rigorous scientific investigation using whether it's psilocybin or mushrooms or whatever, to see what's going on and how useful it can be in different contexts. And the people doing that research tend to be very careful and very responsible. But it's led to the same fears that were happening in the 60s when what started out as scientific research poured out into the streets. And, there was a lot of adulterated drugs going around and a lot of addiction, a lot of craziness. And people are concerned that that could happen too. And now there are the advent of guides, people putting up a shingle and saying, I'll guide you in your medicine trip. Some of whom are well trained, but some of whom are not. And in fact, I will call you, Yvonne, when she introduced me, said I'm on the board of the Association for Spiritual Integrity, and one of the rationale for starting that organization was the abuses of power and scandals that have arisen among spiritual teachers. It's mostly sex scandals and power issues and all that. But we do webinars from time to time. And the next one is about ethics in that world of people using psychedelics and the need for ethical standards and so forth. So I would invite you to go to the ASI website and check it out. But my personal experience is, I haven't taken a drug since 1970, but I can't deny that they had a big, they opened the doors for me back in the day. And I was able to leave them behind, and I'm happy I did. So, but there's risks in these things, and they can be of value. And the context is important, the intention is important, the guidance is important, and being very careful and being very discerning. This is not just going to a yoga class where if you strain your back, you'll get over it tomorrow, or if you have a bad teacher or whatever. These have the potential for genuine spiritual breakthroughs, but they also, have their risks. So be careful.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Philip. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the question and answer period and just say thank you, Philip, for a profound and deeply, deeply informative presentation. Was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, everybody. Stay in touch.